Which melee DPS is the hardest to play in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail? Is there a ranking here, or are they all equally simple and it doesn't matter? Well, I ran some polls to gather some data, with results ranging from 8,000 to way past 10,000 votes, which definitely shows some interesting information. So, what does the community of Final Fantasy XIV, or at least the ones we can poll here, think is the hardest melee DPS? For the longer version of the poll explanation, check the hardest tank video, link in the description. The way the polls are done is that we compare two jobs in pairs until every combination of jobs have been compared, and from this information we can get a ranking of what's harder than what. The question being polled is as simple as, what is the hardest job in your opinion? And welcome to the internet, we simply have to account for the fact that someone might vote based on casual content, hard content, leveling experience, max level experience, difficulty of optimization, or just for the lols. So let's talk about some of the things that can make a job easy or hard and get to the ranking of melee DPS. Dead last, Viper. Considering the talks about just press the glowy button and such that Viper tends to cause, it is probably not that surprising that Viper got the least votes by far among the melees. That doesn't mean Viper does not have its own challenges, but a lot of them focus on the initial learning curve. But with that said, what makes Viper easy? Once the Viper rotation has wound up and started, the filler rotation effectively plays by press the glowy button, a property it shares with Monk. At its most basic level, as long as you're not full on coils and you're not full on gauge, if you have a Vicewinder charge, you could use it, and the order of the follow-ups is flexible. Because Viper does not have a temporary damage buff of its own, outside of a setting involving coordinating rate buff burst windows, Viper can genuinely use their Reawaken burst whenever, or even use it specifically because it is an extended sequence of attacks that don't have positionals. And in more coordinated situations, Viper has more room to be flexible on the burst timing too. Between all the melee DPS, Viper is also the only one that has a naturally occurring ranged attack in its rotation that does not have a strict timer on when you can or should use it in Uncoiled Fury, making it far more flexible about melee uptime compared to the rest of the melees. Among the melees that generate gauge and need a certain amount of gauge for their bursts, Viper distinctly also naturally generates more than what it needs in a 2-minute loop, meaning it can much more easily stomach losing uptime than some of the other jobs. And since its filler combo has nearly no impact on its burst, losing a bit of uptime here and there might not actually affect your rotation in the grander scheme of things. What makes Viper hard? The job starts at level 80, and while its toolkit is pretty straightforward once you get it, the game uses a lot of words in tooltips to get across the relatively simple filler rotation, which makes the job a much better fit for someone who simply grabs the job and tries to press some buttons and see what happens. The often peddled advice of just press the glowy button also falls a bit flat when you realize that it is possible for a Viper to find itself naturally in a state with 5 glowing buttons all at once, and you're just supposed to know which one takes priority at that very moment. Due to a faster than average GCD and all of the follow-up attacks, Viper also is one of the highest APM jobs in the game, frequently featuring the continuation mechanic of an OGSD or two appearing that needs to be addressed immediately or you lose them as the rotation moves on. Where some jobs don't need double weaving at all and some can get by avoiding them, Viper has mandatory double weaves you cannot sidestep under any circumstances whatsoever. This also makes Viper one of the first jobs to sort of slip out of viability if you work with a less than stellar latency. 5th place, Reaper. And unlike Viper, Reaper was actually not nearly as far from 4th place as Viper was from 5th place. But this also makes sense considering that Viper is often referred to as easier Reaper. And before Viper came along, Reaper was largely considered the easy option. But why is that? Well, what makes Reaper easy? Reaper has a lot of the same things going for it that Viper has. also offers Reaper at least one safe ranged attack every now and then that they can choose to fire whenever they want. Reaper also has the strongest infinitely spammable ranged attack among the melee jobs in Harp. It can also store a lot of gauge for when it is needed, being able to store both Shroud Gauge to burst with and Soul Gauge to build more Shroud Gauge with. Also accompanied by options like Soul Slice and Gluttony, letting it build even more gauge quickly. As a result, Reaper is somewhat known for its ability to hold resources, which is sometimes really helpful in situations like ultimates. Now, this doesn't necessarily make the job easier, but it does also mean that if you don't feel like you have a good opportunity to spend resources in a more casual setting, Reaper often has the capacity to hold a bit longer than the other melees. For each burst Reaper does perform, one or two of the attacks, Communio and Perfectio, serve as extra ranged attacks, adding a bit of flexibility as well. Among all the melees, Reaper also has the least positionals to worry about of them all, which, when pushed to its limits, could plan its rotation to fit nearly every positional that ever comes up inside True North, if you so desire. Reaper's Arcane Crest is also one of the stronger and easier to use defensive options among the melees, being a barrier on a short cooldown that even comes with some party healing payoff. What makes Reaper hard? Reaper used to be considered the easy melee for a reason, which, similar to Viper, is a bit funny with it starting at level 70. But unlike Viper, Reaper's starting buttons are more easily read to be understood, although the Gibbet and Gallows mechanic can get a bit convoluted. Aside from that, a lot of conveniences Reaper has, Viper simply does it better. So if you wanted the easy way, Viper is it, not Reaper. Going into more specifics, Reaper gets one safe ranged move in Harvest Moon per time you can set one up, and knowing when you can, and should, set one up also comes with the implication that you need to have spent it before that, and both of these add a lot of extra fight knowledge expectations to Reaper. Reaper's Death's Design is one of the harder damage boosts to manage, as target switching can be incredibly annoying to deal with as a result. Reaper having a temporary damage buff in Arcane Circle also means that it is less flexible than Viper on this, and optimally wants to be sure you have the burst ready for that. And due to the length of the setup itself for the burst, plus other cooldowns like Gluttony crashing into it, it is a lot easier to make a mistake and drop your filler combo in the middle of it. Reaper also deals with something known as gauge negativity, which is to say, most jobs that run the 1 in the odd, 2 in the even minute burst style rotation either get it naturally from cooldowns, reliably generates enough on time, or generates more than enough. Viper is the last of those options. Reaper somewhat uniquely generates too little to keep this up for an extended battle. In full uptime circumstances, this problem doesn't really rear its head until around the 9 or 10 or so minute mark, where things start to slide. Most fights will have had pauses or outright be ending around this time anyway. But where this is more significant is that if you lose uptime due to boss mechanics and whatnot, Reaper feels it more than other jobs, due to the fact it already didn't have any time to spare to begin with. For most players, this issue simply does not come up, and mostly matters for optimization. In fact, a lot of the bigger issues Reaper faces are more focused on optimization, but it really highlights how, in a lot of ways, Reaper is very similar to Viper, but with a bit more going on. Finally, due to the pace of the Enshroud burst, Reaper also can cause issues for players with higher latency, with no easy workaround. 4th place, Dragoon. This is around where things start to get quite interesting, because a significant portion of players actually consider Dragoon quite challenging. With the release of Dawntrail, and also a bit into Dawntrail, Dragoon received significant simplifications and reduction in necessary casts per minute, which, to the experienced player, seemed unnecessary, while the more casual may have found this a huge boon. But this is also one of those jobs where what causes players to find it hard is also the same thing that makes others find it easy, so what is this clash about exactly? What makes Dragoon easy? Being one of the 2 melee DPS that start at level 1 and can be chosen from the very beginning means Dragoon is pretty straightforward to pick up. It also introduces its toolkit very gradually, giving you plenty of time to get used to every part of it. Dragoon's rotation also sort of splits between 2 different sequences, with the GZD focusing on looping the same buttons essentially forever, while the OGZD section barely interacting with it, aside from damage buffs and life surge, allowing you to juggle each part completely separately. Once the Dragoon rotation gets going, it also sort of boils down to a sort of whack-a-mole design of mostly just hitting the cooldowns as they arrive, with a simple GZD keeping you occupied in the meantime. But this is sort of also what causes a pretty clear split, where some players think the job is super straightforward while others find it very difficult. So why would that be? What makes Dragoon hard? A very front and center pain point of Dragoon is the amount of jumps in its rotation that lock it in place or even shove it at the enemy as part of the rotation. The job also has a lot of cooldowns of different lengths that somewhat naturally align with each other, assuming nothing drifts. And if there is enforced downtime at all in a fight or a duty, like a dungeon, things drifting becomes a very likely reality. Due to the way all of the cooldowns are presented, it can also be difficult to learn what order they all go in. What's the order on the damage buffs initially? What's the order on the damage cooldowns? How about all the ready effects of this weird lunchbox rotation we're dealing with? And a lot of the structure of this rotation comes from simply setting up an opener correctly. That way, most of the cooldowns line up where they need to be all on their own, until something drifts again. Finally, in this whole mess, Life Surge bridges the gap between GZD and OGZD and means even when you have set up all the cooldowns correctly, Life Surge comes in with a less predictable, due to downtime sometimes, timing in the burst, since it goes when specific GZDs come up, rather than a specific time in the OGZD order. Ultimately, the key problems that Dragoon deals with is a strict, reasonably high weave count burst that relies on a structured opener to go out just right, with a bunch of awkward mobility restrictions due to jumps. And how well you deal with a structured and strict burst like this is likely to affect how difficult the job feels. The sheer amount of damage buffs also makes the job easily misunderstood, with it being one of the jobs seemingly more prone to the common mistake of holding everything for the boss fight in more casual content, precisely due to how easily things can break and drift apart when you use the cooldowns as they are available. Meanwhile, most of these issues are seen as much more mundane things that a job just does in higher end content. Third place, Samurai. Yet another job where the comments suggested a lot of confusion over how many votes the job got. What is really fascinating about Samurai is that at face value the rotation is super forgiving and lenient, with ways to get back on track with options like Make Your Shisui. And without a personal temporary damage buff, who cares if your cooldowns drift apart? Well, this kind of approach to Samurai actually has a nickname: Freestyle Samurai. But let's get into what makes Samurai easy. Similar to Viper, Samurai does not have a temporary damage buff, and so, as is, has no reason to worry about using its big damage buttons at any particular time beyond when it is available, with the strictest button in the arsenal being Higanbana, needing reapplication every minute. Everything else is just many different ways to hit hard, with Make Your Shisui sort of appearing like an easy way to get back on track if you do mess it up. As long as rate buff coordination isn't a relevant factor, all this makes it a very manageable job to play in casual content especially. On top of all this, Tengetsu also represents one of the stronger defensive cooldowns among DPS. When used right, almost appearing like a slightly watered down tank short defensive cooldown, allowing Samurai to make mistakes more frequently than the rest of the melees, and even be oddly rewarded for it. Also, due to the extremely short cooldowns on Yarten and Jotun, Samurai may well have the greatest capacity to quickly dodge out of any mechanic without losing much uptime. These many small factors make Samurai appear as possibly one of the easiest jobs at face value, but it didn't rank this high in difficulty for nothing, or a grave misunderstanding now did it. What makes Samurai hard? Nearly all of what I just said of convenience with the attack rotation for Samurai is what is commonly known as freestyle Samurai. Why? Because if you just send the cooldowns as they come with little regard for rate buff windows, you are going to drift your dot timing, your damage cooldowns, and perhaps more obviously, a lot of Keishi Setsugekas are going to miss damage buffs they didn't have to miss. When played optimally, Samurai's rotation relies on a very specific GCD, so a specific amount of skill speed, which gives rise to two different rotations, the slow Samurai and the fast Samurai, and both loop their rotations in a very specific way to make sure they have everything ready to blast exactly as every 2-minute burst begins. Things like losing uptime, optimally, requires counting how many GCDs you lost so you can use specific tricks to catch up again, or stall extra to realign the rotation backwards. And if you lose track, it might be impossible to find your way back. Once properly practiced, this isn't as hard as it sounds, but it does make the job a lot harder when trying to optimize than when you just push buttons. Something like Make Your Shisui also instantly morphs from a "oh, I need to get back on track" button into a damage burst button once you focus on maximizing your damage output. When it comes to slightly softer difficulties than optimizing the job, many also find it difficult to learn Samurai due to the naming of all of its actions. For a lot of players, sort of being about as good as gibberish. Second place, Monk. This one received a lot of similar comments to Black Mage in that it appeared to the more experienced player as if the overall community didn't recognize how much simpler Monk had been made with Dawntrail. However, now with a greater focus on press the glowy button, what remains becomes extremely odd and unintuitive when you don't already know the answer, making the job a lot harder to pick up than you might imagine. So, what makes Monk easy? A huge part of the Monk rotation nowadays feels like just press the glowy button, with slightly less potential glowy buttons than Viper. And when it comes to the Monk burst, there aren't that many extra buttons to worry about, with a significant portion of it boiling down to more filler buttons. With the changes introduced in Dawntrail, Monk also has a similar benefit to Black Mage in that there aren't any timers to maintain. Not really. And by level 52, downtime enables you to set up to start again from the top quite easily. And when it comes to Monk's burst, while optimally it is used at specific times in the filler rotation, the on-ramp is very lenient, so as long as you know what to do, it is pretty manageable. That being said, what makes Monk hard? To start, Monk has the fastest baseline GCD of all jobs, giving you half a second less to think compared to the average job. This alone can be a bit surprising to a less experienced player, and can cause problems for players with less than stellar connections. Due to Monk's crit-procced chakra, Monk is also one of very few jobs with any randomness in their rotation, although spending the chakra is usually very straightforward, as you should have plenty of OGCD space to get it done. But the real kicker when it comes to difficulty is in the unintuitiveness of Monk's burst buttons. While once you know, it comes somewhat naturally that perfect balance is used specifically after finishing a step 1 GCD. The numbers are close enough that it can be really difficult to tell that the step 1 GCDs, Dragon Kick and Bootshine or Leaping Oppo, are the most valuable, and for a lot of players, the reason why this seems so obvious is because the step 2s and 3s were made to manage other stuff in the past. So the Dawntrail version sort of came in swinging, being designed to still follow the same pattern of making sure the step 1s were the best to spam. But if you don't know that, and don't learn it from someone else, it can be extremely difficult to figure out on your own, due to the crit calculations necessary to even stand a chance of knowing. And it gets even weirder when it comes to low-level Monk, where in the levels where you have perfect balance but not masterful blitz, unless you're AoEing, skipping perfect balance altogether is actually better. And it is admittedly very rare for jobs to have cooldowns that are best avoided to that extent. And these are just the front and center things. When it comes to optimal rotations, the detail that Monk wants to double down on Luna to effectively stall Phantom Rush a minute is similarly very counterintuitive. For a bit of comparison, before Dawntrail, Dragoon had a similar trick in that you commonly used Geishgagul first and then jump, because using Geishgagul after 2 jumps activated Life of the Dragon, and if you did jump first, that would mean Life would activate outside of your damage buffs, on the half minute instead of the whole minute. In a similar fashion, if Monk does not stall Phantom Rush in this way, it lands in the odd minute, where less damage buffs are present. In a sense, a lot of the things that make Monk appear so simple is because a lot of the veteran players learned those features half a decade ago when they were more clear and prominent, and even if the same issue is present now, with the timers removed, a newer player to the job might find it very difficult to tell. The hardest melee DPS. Ninja. While the job has been made easier by removing the Huton timer and by making Tenchi Jin mobile and things like that, the core of what makes Ninja are things that make the job a lot harder to simply pick up and play than most jobs. Where jobs like Viper saw through just go to a dummy and press buttons, you just might figure it out there. Ninja sort of needs you to actually sit down and read its actions for you to stand a chance. Regardless, what makes Ninja easy? By Dawntrail standards, Ninja has one of the simplest filler rotations in the game, using a simple 1-2-3 combo where you just have to choose between building or spending a resource. That is used for nothing else and has no timer on it. For the most part, the filler also hardly features in the burst itself, so lost uptime, as long as it doesn't land during the burst itself, is almost irrelevant. Shukuchi also gives Ninja a ton of free movement if you need it, not to mention the fact that Ninja naturally runs a bit faster than other jobs, although that effect doesn't stack with Sprint. Now, it is worth mentioning that the fact that Ninja's rotation heavily centers on its burst, meaning that you have a lot of room to just hang out between them, is a factor that a lot of more experienced players see as a point for Ninja being easy rather than hard. However, what makes Ninja hard? To begin, Ninja is one of, if not the most burst-centric job in the game. You have loads of cooldowns that mostly are on either a 1 minute or 2 minute, and then the jutsus that hold 2 charges, but in a roundabout way are used as if they have 3 for the burst. Bunshin also introduces a factor where some of your bursts have this extra thing to consider, but not every burst. Due to Ninja's 2-minute burst generating 40 gauge immediately, but 90 in total over its duration, it is worth mentioning that stockpiling gauge isn't nearly as important for the job as others, but that doesn't change the fact that planning it out properly, you still can stockpile some gauge. In a way, Dragoon is similar to Ninja in the way of really emphasizing bursts, but due to Dragoon's design, it is a lot more lenient when it does come, and Ninja's burst is a lot stricter on the timing of everything. As much as hesitating means something important misses a buff, and since burst windows are not necessarily something a more casual player is super focused on, this makes Ninja, right out the gate, a much harder job to pick up. In addition to this, where a lot of jobs are made in a way where it is almost easier to simply try and push some buttons to figure it out as you go, Viper being a prominent example, Ninja's jutsus effectively requires you to sit down and read through the actions. Among them, Ninja also has jutsus that are simply never helpful, except when they are, with Huma Shuriken being the only actual physical damage jutsu, and Hyoton turning into Hyoshoranryu conditionally. Meaning, similar to some other jobs perceived as very difficult, Ninja has several actions that are meant to be avoided. And let's also not forget about the bunny failure state. While Monk can goof up their perfect balance and lose a bunch of damage, when Ninja goofs up, which is a lot easier to do by the way, the whole spell just fizzles altogether. We also have more strategic details like when to use dot on an AoE and where to place it, not to mention how problematic latency can be when it comes to jutsus. And while far less prominent than for Samurai, Ninja also has a bit of the gibberish action names for the average player. Just to really emphasize, I think the biggest difficulty of Ninja is the fact that it needs you to get the burst right, while the burst is very strict and has multiple things you're supposed to just remember. And in a way, the burst starts up to 20 seconds before it actually starts blasting off, due to preparing things like Suiton and Kasatsu. So while the job has one of the simplest filler rotations, it is accompanied by one of the most demanding bursts in the game. But with all that said, which melee do you find the hardest? Personally, I'd probably put Monk a lot lower, but aside from that, I think the order's probably fine to me. It all really depends on what you focus on. For example, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so jobs where you can more easily make a mistake that is not easily recovered, or where the mistake is very obvious, tend to rank higher in difficulty to me. This is quite clear with jobs like Ninja and Dragoon, where if your burst drifts too much apart, things just don't fit anymore. Meanwhile, jobs like Viper and Samurai can, in more casual situations, easily get away with kinda just winging it, although Samurai optimally does run something more strict. That being said, I've never been super dedicated to melees, being more of a mage enjoyer myself, so it probably comes as no surprise I would have a preference for the simpler melees, especially ones with decent ranged options. But do let me know your thoughts in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, originally Dragoon's Blood of the Dragon passive was an activated effect that you maintained with Fang and Claw and Wheeling Thrust, and in Heavensward, Geishkagul was a way to vent exasperation on the buff for extra damage. This was changed in Stormblood when they added the whole Life of the Dragon effect, although the maintaining of the effect was kept in place. It was simply the payoff that was adjusted.